This chapter 9, we'll explore firewall and intrusion prevention system. And since many businesses have presence online, meaning they are involved in commercial transaction, whether they are banks, online stores like Macy's, Gap, Nordstrom, and doctor's office. And so every business has an online presence, and hence the resources on the network are prone to attack by an intruder. And the purpose of the intruder is to steal the sensitive data that is available on the resources on the network. So that could be like credit card information, personal information, medical information, etc., etc. And so the businesses have to look for a means for securing these assets from against the intruders, or somehow mitigate all the threats. And so in this chapter, we'll explore all of that technologies that are out there. So let's move on to the next slide. So, and so as we said, the e-commerce needs internet connectivity for online presence. So we need to protect the resources that are available on the network. So what is a firewall? Firewall is actually a physical device that you see down on the right-hand corner. So it's a combination of both hardware and software. It could have multiple ports for connectivity, and the software works on the basis of what we call the TCP and UDP and IP protocol. Basically, it would examine a packet that is entering the network or a packet that is leaving the network. So look at the IP address, look at the TCP, UDP port, etc., etc., or even the application like HTTP, SMTP for email, and will examine each packet and would then make a determination whether the packet can either enter the network or the packet can leave the network, meaning exit the network. So basically, a firewall is a device that is placed on the perimeter of the network. So it's a perimeter device, and so it defines the inside of the network from the outside of the network. The inside of the network is what we call the intranet, and the outside to the firewall is what we call the internet, right? So you can think of as a single choke point, where every packet must go through, that content of the packet must be examined before it is permitted to enter the network. And so here's an illustration of firewall. So we see down here the internet, and this is the router that connects the internal network to the internet. And so that's an example of an external firewall. Then we have switches, and we could also have an internal firewall, right? So this is your web server, email server, and the DNS server. And the resources on this network, known as a demilitarized zone, are always accessible to any user from the outside. And so we have resources here, which could be a database server that you don't want any authorized access to, so that has to be placed behind the firewall. This is just one schematic diagram. In an enterprise network, you have thousands of computers, so they could also be internal firewall. Let's say, for example, records from that reside with the HR, human resources, should not be accessible by any other employees on the in the business or in the corporate. Then there would be an internal firewall to protect the resources that reside on the HR. And then likewise for any others, customer records that could be with the salespeople. So there would be a combination of the internal firewall and an external firewall. And so here, just to kind of emphasize, router is a device that connects the entire network to the internet. And so on the router, we run a device that actually translates the private addresses to a public address to go out to the internet. And in our previous lectures, we talked about a public address and a private address. So when computers on here are assigned private addresses, they cannot be seen from the outside, meaning from any user on the internet. And the role of the router is to convert the private IP address to a public IP address so it could be routed on the internet. So there has to be some design goals. All traffic from inside to outside and vice versa must pass through the firewall, meaning every packet must be examined and to see that is this packet permitted to enter or leave the network. And the thing to bear in mind is the firewall itself is immune to any kind of penetration, meaning the firewall cannot be compromised by a malware, a virus, or rootkit, or any of those resources. Otherwise, the firewall would serve no purpose. So the chief security officer with the network engineers and network administrator have to come up with some access policy, right? Security policy. And then these security policies are translated into who can access the resource in the network. And that's the security policies are then implemented on the firewall. So we have a set of rules are prescribed to a firewall software and says, hey, examine each packet either entering or the leaving, right? And so this will include the range of IP addresses, the TCP, UDP, IP protocol, the application that an external user may be trying to access behind the firewall. For example, a client may be wanting to send an email to salespeople for purchase, like we do all the time if you buy things on Amazon. So an online presence requires an inline email communication between the user, between the client and the server, right? And all of that stuff. So the chief security officer has to, with the network engineer, have to define the policy, right? So basically, in the later chapters, when we move to chapter 14 and 15, we'll talk about identify the assets, what level of security an asset needs, etc., and then define the security policy, and then actually implement the policy, and then also have to monitor the packets that enter and leave the network. So in case you need to reconfigure the firewall, yes, you can reconfigure the firewall, right? So going back to the 4 levels, right? So first we talk about IP address and a protocol value, right? So IP address, you look at the IP address, that is IP address of a packet that is trying to enter the network, and then the address of the network is checked against the rules and say, can this IP address or the network address either is permitted to enter the network or denied, right? If you're trying to access, or rather sending an email, then 2 email server need to talk to each other using a TCP protocol, right? So that requires a connection-oriented service, in which case the firewall is also designed to make a determination whether the email servers are permitted to set up a connection-oriented service, right? So I kind of will get more in depth into that. Then there is also an application protocol, right? So application protocol would be like HTTP, SMTP, etc. And there is a means of setting up the firewall policy, so you have no direct connection between 2 endpoints, but you set up a proxy, and both the endpoints will deal with the proxy. So that adds a degree of security. You can also identify the users that are trying to connect to the network and what kind of activity is being requested on the network. For example, database is normally accessed, let's say, between 10 and 12 and between 3 and 5. So if you see a lot of activity on a database server at 7 in the evening, then that would be considered to be not normal, as we talked in the intrusion detection chapter. Right? So what are the capabilities and what are the limits, right? So capabilities, you can define a single choke point. Well, obviously, having a single choke point would make every packet to go in and enter the network will slow down, right? But that's something you need, right? Can serve as also as a platform for IPsec. We'll talk about IPsec. It's basically authentication and encryption being used. So meaning packets of data are encrypted and there is an authentication going on between the client and the server. And after the second exam, when we deal with chapter 22 called SSL, we'll talk more about IPsec. Well, cannot protect against attack by passing the firewall. It definitely will slow down the traffic that is entering and leaving the network. But the network engineer and the network security personnel will have to make a decision between what kind of traffic to permit to enter the network and decide. So if the employees complain that the firewall is slowing down the traffic, then the network security people may have to open up and do less checking. And so apart from a firewall having physical connection, firewall has what we call TCP, UDP, and IP protocols loaded on it. And so in the previous chapter, we talked about TCP, UDP port numbers, right? And so we'll look at the 65,535 ports that are available on a firewall. So let's see, we have 4 different types of firewall. So we have what we call a packet filtering firewall. So the packet filtering firewall, as it shows in here, end-to-end transport connection. So we talked about the transport layer, right? So here it talks about end-to-end transport, meaning the TCP connection on the client has a connection to the TCP connection on the server. So that's what they mean by an end-to-end connection. But the packet filtering nature of the firewall simply looks at the IP address of the packet. And basically it looks into the IP header and says, what is the source address and what's the destination address? And then looks against the firewall policy and says, is this source IP address permitted to enter the network? Is this source IP address permitted to talk to the destination IP address? So for example, it could be a web client and a web server, right? And a web client has an IP address and a web server has an IP address. So it will examine simply the IP address. Therefore, it's known as a packet filtering. Then the next one we have what we call a stateful inspection. Again, this provides end-to-end connectivity from one end to the other end, meaning between the two ends. Except in a stateful inspection firewall, the firewall makes a note of the established connection between the client and the server. So by that I mean, remember we talked about in the earlier chapter, connection-oriented service simply means that you need a sync and ACK and an ACK, right? So it'll make a note of who are these clients that want to talk to the servers behind the firewall. It'll simply make a note of all of that stuff. And so if it sees a packet coming from a client that has not established a connection, or meaning it's not a part of ongoing conversation, then will not permit that packet to enter the network. And again, so this basically slows down. So packet filtering is a lot easier. Look at the IP address, source and destination, and make a decision to let the packet go in or not. So the stateful inspection will now require to record each transaction that's going in and going out, right? But these two could normally work very well. So the packet filtering is normally set up on the what you call the perimeter router, as we saw in the previous slide, and the stateful inspection is actually set up on the firewall itself. Then we have 2 other kinds of firewall called application proxy and a circuit level proxy. The application level proxy firewall simply looks at the content of the application. So if it's an HTTP protocol or an SMTP protocol or an FTP protocol, it will verify that the application that claims to be an HTTP or SMTP is the content of that packet. So again, we have a proxy server here. So the client will not make a direct connection to the application behind the firewall, but the client will make a connection to a proxy, and then the proxy would make a connection to the server, and the server would send the data to the proxy, and the proxy would then forward the data to the client. Again, that slows down the traffic entering and leaving the network. And the final kind is called a circuit level. So it's similar to a stateful inspection, but not quite. It doesn't keep track of the ongoing conversation. And so historically, we had packet filtering, stateful, application, and circuit, and application and circuit are all bundled into one. So let's get a little bit more in depth into packet filtering firewall. Application rules to each incoming and outgoing IP packet. So it looks at the source address, the destination address. It will also look into the source and destination transport level, which are basically what we call the TCP port numbers, right? And then at the bottom, as it says, two default policies: discard or forward. So discard means prohibit unless expressly permitted, right? Discard meaning if an address is permitted, it will be gone in. If there is no rule for the address to be permitted to enter the network, then by default it'll prohibit from entering the network. And so forward means if the rule says this IP address can enter the network, then it'll be permitted to enter the network. So by default, the firewall is defined, the security policy of the firewall is to block any packet entering or leaving the network by default. And then you say which IP addresses are permitted to enter the network and which IP addresses are permitted to leave the network. So by default, nothing is permitted to enter or leave the network. So we'll see in the next slide some packet filtering example here. So these are the rules, as it says under the rule column. So what are the advantages and disadvantages meaning of it? It's very simple, typically transparent to user, and are very fast. Well, cannot prevent attacks that employ application specific. So you could claim to be an HTTP packet, or you could claim to be an SMTP packet, but inside the SMTP packet, you could have put in a malware or a virus or a rootkit, right? So it's basically, think of a bouncer who's standing on the door and says, okay, let me see, if you're wearing a green badge, I will allow you. If you're wearing a red badge, then I can't let you in, right? But he will not know what is the intention of the packet or the intention of the person that is permitted to enter, right? And so it's vulnerable to all kind of attacks. Then we talk about what we call a stateful inspection. So the phrase stateful inspection means that the firewall has made a record of conversation between the two endpoints. So this is on top of the packet filtering. So now we are tightening the rules, who can enter the network and who can enter the network, right? So packet filter allows incoming traffic to high number ports. And so let's see examples of a stateful packet filter. So source address 100, port number 1030, destination port 29, destination address 29, and the port number 80, right? So now it knows that somebody from outside was as an ongoing conversation to IP address .29 on destination port 80, right? So you understand that the state of the connection was established, right? And so here we got 102.101 established. So it has this thing here. So it has to make a note of the ongoing connection. So if somebody is trying to enter the network without establishing a connection, would be denied, right? So we talked about the flags in the TCP header, right? We talked about the faint flag, the ACK flag, the sync flag, and the RST, right? Reset. So a reset flag is used for that purpose. Hey, you're not a part of ongoing conversation, so I'm simply going to reset my connection with you, right? So then we talked about the application level gateway or proxy, right? Application proxy, right? So user must connect to this proxy. The user is authenticated. And then the proxy would then talk to the server behind it. And then the server would send the packets of data to the proxy, and the proxy would forward back to the client, right? And then we have what we call a circuit level, right? So it, again, sort of two TCP connection between itself and the user. So it's a circuit level proxy. Works pretty similar to an application level, right? So let's look at what we call a bastion host, right? So in the system identified as critical strong points in the network security, right? So the hosts that are very difficult to compromise, right? So they may run a very secure operating system. Again, it says it may require user authentication to access proxy or host, right? And so these bastion hosts come into play mostly in enterprise network, right? And we'll see examples further down. So now, how do we implement, or where do we implement the firewall? So the firewall could be a host base. So I could actually run a firewall software on my computer. For example, a database server or an email server or web server, and keep track of who is wanting to make a connection, right? Or what could run, as we'll see in the upcoming slide, a network-based firewall, right? So what is a VPN? After the second exam, when we talked about IPsec protocol, or rather what we call an SSL, just to kind of give you an overview of virtual private networking, VPN, right? So if you are working for Alpha Beta Corporation and you need to access services at your corporation site, how would you establish a secure connection between the two endpoints? Because remember, the traffic on the internet is like, it's a public highway, right? So anybody could sniff on the internet and pick up sensitive information between the client and the server at the corporation website. So here is the user system that runs IPsec. It's a set of security protocols, encryption and authentication that runs at the network layer, or rather below the network layer. And what it does, it actually creates an IP header. And so let's take an example. Your application level creates a string of messages that are taken by a TCP protocol and creates a TCP segment. Each segment is put into an IP packet, and then the IP packet, before it's put into an Ethernet frame, the entire IP packet is now encrypted. So if somebody were to sniff on the network, unless they had the encryption algorithm, they would not be able to decipher that. So that's what this is doing here. So public network, you are securing the complete. So you have the IP payload. This is the IPsec header, and then on top of that, it actually creates another header. So the packet could be identified when it goes back to the client here, or rather the server, right? Yeah, we'll talk more about that later on. But just going to be so what we have is between the client and the server. So if I am at home and I want to talk to my database server at my company, then I would set up a virtual private network, a VPN. So basically, my laptop computer has all the encryption algorithm given in that, and when my network, when my computer wants to talk to a database server at my corporate site, I would be authenticated by a VPN server. So there would be a VPN server here that would authenticate me. And once I'm authenticated, I actually have set up a private tunnel in the public highway. That's what a virtual private network means. So this is an example of what we call a distributed firewall, a common example for an enterprise network. So here we have a remote user connected to the internet. This is an external DMZ zone, demilitarized zone. A web server could be placed here. So the web server basically has a public IP address. So anybody can from here can talk to the web server. There is that's what you mean by a router. A router that's placed on the boundary of the internet and the intranet. And then we have an external firewall. These are the internal demilitarized zone. Again, there is a switch, which is nothing other than a concentrator. That it has all these three computers connected on three different ports on a switch, right? And then we have internal firewall that connects to one port on a switch. Then we have another switch, and then we have these protected resources on the network, right? So here we have one firewall that protects everything, then you have another firewall that protects. So then each of them could have what we call a host-based firewall, a DNS. So this is just an illustration. In the real practical world, normally you would not have a firewall on a DNS server, and a firewall on an email server, and a firewall on a web server. Not necessarily a physical device, because that would slow the traffic down entering and leaving the network. So here we have the firewall topologies. Could be host resident firewall, personal firewall, screening router, which is being the router that sits on the perimeter of the network. It could do both packet filtering, and it could also do it could do a full packet filtering. Single bastion inline, another internal external router, and at the previous slide on the distributed firewall, this slide refers to that, right? So let's look into the extension of intrusion detection. So intrusion prevention system, it basically works with the intrusion detection, and if an intrusion detection detects a data packet that could be a threat to the network, then the role of the intrusion prevention would be to absorb that packet, isolate that packet, so it no longer poses a threat to the network. And again, so that could be either running a host base, a network base, or you could have a distributed, meaning both host and a network, right? So again, it uses what we call previously, it could be anomaly based, or it could be signature based, or a combination of both of them. So host-based IPS heaps, it can make use of either signature or anomaly detection, right? So basically, whatever we talked about in the IDS is now applicable to IPS. So what is a sandbox approach? A sandbox approach is when the IDS and IPS combination senses that this data packet might have a virus, malware, or a rootkit. And we'll cover all of these things more into chapter 6 later on. But any kind of malware, then what it'll do is basically it will isolate that and put into a sandbox, so it doesn't get into the network. And so once the threat packet is put into sandbox, then the network engineers or the network security personnel could examine that data packet and then make a determination of what kind of virus, malware, or rootkit it contain or is placed inside the data packet, right? So they could then inform the virus checker, people who make and distribute the virus programs, right, or antivirus, right, and would then add this newly defined malware and say, okay, now watch out for this newly defined virus. So basically, what am I saying is that if you pick up a signature from a data packet that you've not seen before, so now you can add that signature to your database, and if you see in future a signature like this, then that would mean that this should be a malware or a virus or a rootkit, right? So basically, you keep building your database up for protection, right? So what's the role of the host-based IPS? So many industry observers see the enterprise endpoint, right? So what is an endpoint? Endpoint are nothing other than the desktop computers there where your employees sit at the desktop computer and either use the resources on the internet or use the resources on the internet, right? So the security vendors are focusing more on developing endpoint security products. And that's one of the reasons in every corporation has a security policy that you simply cannot browse anywhere on the internet. And so that would be enforcing the endpoint security, right? So we have a network base, so you'll have an IDS, IPS working on a switch, and it could do pattern matching, stateful matching, protocol anomaly, traffic anomaly, and statistical that we covered in the IDS chapter. And if it detects a packet, threat packet, then it'll isolate that in a sandbox and then update the security rules to prevent such packets from entering the network, right? And I believe that's the end of the slideshow.